Continuing now with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's The Final Days. When we ended the last session, we were in the middle of Chapter 11, so we'll continue with Chapter 11 now. That afternoon, 200 miles to the north of Camp David, Sybil Kucharski, a young bank teller, completed her obligations as foreman of a jury in the United States Courthouse in Foley Square, New York City. At 12:57 p.m., she stood in front of the bench in an old and dark courtroom and proceeded to pronounce not guilty 18 times. Former Attorney General John N. Mitchell and former Commerce Secretary Maurice H. Stans, the principal officials of the president's 1972 campaign, were acquitted on all counts in the Vesco case. "We got to the jury system, and that always works," Mitchell said. 9 minutes later, the news reached Jowan at the White House, and he called Camp David. The president was elated. It was surely the best news in more than a year. Haig and Ziegler had been briefing him daily on the case, and he had been looking for acquittals. He called Mitchell and Stans to congratulate them. Later, he talked with David Eisenhower. The agony of his subordinates was the most painful part of Watergate, he said. It was a relief that these men weren't going to jail because of their association with him. They were close friends. It felt good to be able to communicate with them again. "They are good men," the president said. The acquittals appeared to end the president's indecision about whether the transcript should be released. He had fretted too long. It was time to act. He gave Haig the go-ahead, but not before he had solved some of his last-minute editing problems by literally throwing several pages away. As the sheer mechanics of preparing the transcripts for public consumption intensified, David Hoops, an aide in the office of the staff secretary, summoned the State Department's silk screener from a baseball game. Hoops shared the general White House concern for packaging, and he had designed a cover for the master sets of transcripts. He ordered the silk screener to prepare black vinyl binders, 2 for each conversation. Each binder was to be stamped with a gold presidential seal, and just above it, a gold embossed legend reading, "Submission of recorded presidential conversations to the Committee on the Judiciary of the House of Representatives by President Richard Nixon." They would look great on television, Hoops thought. That afternoon, Pat Buchanan got a set of the transcripts. Still unbound and without the president's final expurgations, from Special Presidential Counsel Richard Moore. Buchanan had seen much of the material before, so the content did not much surprise him. But he was startled at the idea that the transcripts were to be just dumped on the press and the public without any explanatory text. The scenario he had devised last December for the release of certain transcripts had been ignored. A public relations disaster was in the making, he told Moore. Leonard Garment asked for a copy of the transcripts. His request was denied. Later in the afternoon, a dozen members of the speechwriting and communication staffs gathered in the office of Ken W. Clausen, White House Director of Communications. Bazart and St. Clair, who had arranged the meeting, were delayed. So Clausen passed out copies of the 40-page brief that St. Clair had prepared for submission to the Judiciary Committee. The document quoted extensively from portions of the transcripts which tended to support the president's version of events. The brief was essentially a savage attack on John Dean, taking what advantage it could of his rare memory lapses before the Watergate Committee. Clausen was buoyant, partly because of the Mitchell-Stans verdict and partly as a result of what the president's lawyers had told him. The end of Watergate was finally at hand, he assured his colleagues. The transcripts would win the day. He referred to the president's speech. "Watergate is going to go away tomorrow," he assured them. Speechwriter Bernstein, a Yale Law School graduate and the son of Nixon's chief economic advisor, Herbert Stein, was dubious. "You don't really believe that, Ken, do you?" His tone was contemptuous. Stein had worked too long on the defense to take the lawyers or Clausen seriously. Clausen ignored him. "I want you to go back to your office and write speeches for our congressman based on St. Clair's brief. Say the president is innocent and has finally been proven." The speechwriters would get transcripts later. All they needed at present was the brief. Stein exchanged skeptical looks with David Gergen, a tall Harvard law graduate who ran the White House speechwriting office. "Knowing the lawyers, I sure hate to rely on this kind of summary for that kind of statement," Stein said. Gergen agreed. Bazart and St. Clair had not yet arrived. They waited a few more minutes, and then Clausen recessed the meeting. "Write your little speeches, and then we'll regroup later," he said. At about 6 p.m., the group filed into Clausen's office again to watch televised accounts of the Mitchell-Stans acquittal. The verdict seemed to support the White House claim that Watergate was an obsession limited to Washington and the news media. The people, the real people, didn't much care about Watergate. They didn't find it so serious. Even in sophisticated New York City, the headquarters of the Eastern liberal establishment, a jury of 12 men and women had voted not guilty on all charges. But beyond temporary morale boosting and not a little gloating, the news had even more serious and more encouraging implications. John Dean had been a key prosecution witness, and apparently the jury had not believed him. "Now we should have the Attorney General ask the special prosecutor why perjury charges aren't being brought against John Dean," suggested Kenneth Kachigian, an aide to Buchanan. Clausen announced that St. Clair and Bazart would arrive at any moment. Stein was struck by Clausen's tone. It approached reverence. "You would think we were waiting for the Wizard of Oz," he said to Gergen. The lawyers at last joined the group around the large round conference table. In contrast to the informality of the staffers' Sunday sports clothes, they wore dark business suits. St. Clair took off his coat and began talking about, quote, the light at the end of the tunnel. His enthusiasm was boundless as he reiterated Clausen's theme. You can write something saying that the end of Watergate is near. The tapes would prove John Dean a liar. Clausen hung on every word. He nodded encouragement. Then Bazart spoke briefly, but no less optimistically. Stein and Gergen were dumbstruck. Neither Clausen nor Bazart nor St. Clair had offered anything specific. How was this miraculous turn of events to come to pass? It was a pep rally. Clichés, cheers, exhortations. Stein rose. "Do you really think that this is the end?" He was facing St. Clair, his voice dripping sarcasm. Clausen glared at Stein as if he were crazy to ask the question. Stein thought the meeting had taken on a lunatic quality. "There will be several rough days," St. Clair said, "but a careful examination of the transcripts will convince people we're right. We're definitely out of the woods." Gergen shook his head. He was wondering why the tapes had been withheld for almost a year if they were finally going to end Watergate. Haig called a cabinet meeting for Monday evening, April 29th. As the cabinet members arrived, they passed the Oval Office furniture, which had been moved into the hallway to make room for the television crew that was setting up for the president's speech an hour later. They took their places in the high-backed brown leather chairs around the 20-foot oval table. The president had bought the table and had said he would leave it to the White House when he left office. The president's chair was empty. Vice President Ford was the ranking official in the room. Finally, the president's chief of staff marched in. This was Haig's meeting. The room was quiet. Haig, deadly serious, began. There were 1,254 pages of transcripts that were going to be released the next day. They would make for a rough several days. The president's language was often coarse. "It's the kind of language you probably used in your office this morning," Haig told them. Then, finished with the bad news, he turned to the good news. The transcripts would put Watergate behind them. He turned the meeting over to St. Clair, who outlined the basic points of his brief. To the junior staff aides seated on the side of the room, the cabinet meeting sounded like the same pep rally they had attended in Clausen's office the evening before. Haig described how difficult the transcribing process had been, a tedious, almost impossible assignment because of the poor quality of the recordings. "I have purposely not listened to the tapes because I take the president personally at his word," Haig continued. But he wanted them to understand the immense technical problems the transcribers and lawyers have been confronted with. Bazart, sitting at the side of the room beside a tape recorder, got his cue from Haig. They were going to play a portion of one of the clearer tapes, Haig announced. Though this was not true, it was not one of the clearer tapes. Some of the cabinet members could distinguish the president's voice, but the words were almost unintelligible. Bazart let the tape run for a minute or so to dramatize the problem. Bazart and Haig wanted a whole cabinet of witnesses who could attest to the bad quality of the tapes. It might help them get by all the questions they were certain to be asked about the shortcomings of the transcripts. Now Haig raised a troublesome point. Some cabinet members were defending the president vigorously. Earl L. Butz of Agriculture, Roger C.B. Morton of Interior and Frederick B. Dent of Commerce were doing a splendid job, but others were oddly quiet. Haig hoped that now, with evidence from the tapes to support them, they all would go out and proclaim the president's innocence. A few minutes before 9 p.m., the president walked into the Oval Office and went to a side table on which the gold-embossed transcript binders were stacked side by side for the cameras. Some of them contained only a single page of transcript. Nixon picked up one binder, opened it for a second, and with a look of disbelief and a slight shake of his head, threw it back. Then he sat down behind the big desk and waited for the television technicians to check their lighting and camera positions. As the president waited to deliver his speech, Lazard called the lawyers for Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell to tell them what was coming. "Is it going to do my client any damage?" asked John J. Wilson, Haldeman's attorney. "Yes," Lazard answered. "What the hell is the president going to do that for? Did you recommend it?" Lazard did not reply. Wilson grunted. He didn't like it, but he understood. At 45 seconds past 9 p.m., the president began. "In these transcripts, portions not relevant to my knowledge or actions with regard to Watergate are not included, but everything that is relevant is included, the rough as well as the smooth," he said. Holding the pages of the 14th draft of his speech, he referred to, quote, "the strategy sessions, the explorations of alternatives, the weighing of human and political costs laid out in the transcripts. These materials, together with those already made available, will tell it all." By providing transcripts instead of the tapes, he was at once protecting the principle of presidential confidentiality and enabling the Congress to meet its constitutional responsibilities. The impeachment of a president was a remedy of last resort, which would put the nation through a wrenching ordeal. The impact of such an ordeal would be felt throughout the world, and it would have its effect on the lives of all Americans for many years to come. Because this is an issue that profoundly affects all the American people, in addition to turning over these transcripts to the House Judiciary Committee, I have directed that they should all be made public. The camera panned across the room to the two stacks. All of these that you see there, that you see here, they will at last once and for all show that what I knew and what I did with regard to the Watergate break-in and cover-up were just as I have described them to you from the beginning. In giving you these, blemishes and all, I am placing my trust in the basic fairness of the American people. The president did not provide the transcripts that evening. He wanted the speech to be considered in its own context. Even Nixon's most severe critics thought the speech a very good one, at the least artfully constructed. The admissions he had made in the address, I several times suggested that meeting Hunt's demands might be necessary, seemed to make his broader claim of innocence more believable. The speech was less strident than usual and less self-serving. The White House gathered an 8-page summary of favorable reaction to the speech. The most encouraging signs came from key Republicans on the Hill. Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott welcomed as evidence of good faith the wealth of material which the president was forwarding to the House committee. Senator Robert P. Griffin, Republican whip, said it was an effective presentation by a confident president. Senator Barry Goldwater said the offer of the transcripts was both fair and reasonable and should be sufficient unless the House committee was engaged in a fishing expedition. House Minority Leader John J. Rhodes said the plan sounds logical to me. Vice President Ford said the president is giving the Judiciary Committee more than enough information with which to carry out its investigation. I think the president is being more than cooperative. Such statements were exactly what the White House had hoped for, the kind of reaction which would undercut protest from the House Judiciary Committee. Any further demands from the committee would seem like harassment. On the next morning, April 30th, a White House station wagon carried unbound copies of the transcripts to Capitol Hill, one set for each of the members of the House Judiciary Committee and the leaders of both parties. At the government printing office, sets of the transcripts were being bound in bulky, 3-inch thick volumes with blue covers. As the first copies were being bound, Ziegler and Clausen put their plan into action. They canceled the morning press briefing and arranged for the reporters to receive St. Clair's brief, but not the transcripts, in the early afternoon. Thus, the afternoon papers would have only the White House interpretation of the transcripts. The press office announced that the transcripts would be arriving as soon as they left the GPO presses. but several unbound copies were already circulating among the staff. Gergen had gotten hold of one the night before and had stayed up reading in his office until 3 a.m. The next morning he approached Bernstein, who was working on a housing statement. "The moral authority of the president is collapsing," Gergen said. "How can you be thinking about housing?" When the bound transcripts arrived from the GPO, Bazart and St. Clair autographed copies for the secretaries. Bazart got 250 copies and sent them to his friends and former colleagues at the Pentagon. The 200,000 words of edited transcripts were finally given to the press about 2 hours before the network's evening newscasts. Ziegler had hoped that the reporters wouldn't have enough time to locate the material that would undermine St. Clair's brief, but they lost no time in getting to the March 21st transcript. "You have no choice but to come up with the $120,000. Keep the cap on the bottle. Buy time. Tough it through." The evening newscasts were filled with these remarks, and as well with the coarser side of President Nixon. "I want the most comprehensive notes on all those who tried to do us in. They are asking for it, and they are going to get it. Have you kicked a few butts around?" The transcripts would provide grief for many sensational stories in the press, the president said. The transcripts would, quote, "provide grist for many sensational stories in the press," the president said in his speech. He was right. The Chicago Tribune reprinted the transcripts verbatim in a special section. 2 paperback book editions of the released script were rushed into print, and they sold millions. Radio and television network broadcasts offered readings in which newsmen and actors dramatized the parts of the president, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Dean. Ziegler complained. The actors attached twists and inflections to the words. Jokes about deleted expletives made the rounds. There seemed to be no end. Ken Clausen, meanwhile, was distributing to White House aides a list of all the radio talk shows in major cities. A covering memorandum suggested that members of the White House staff phone the stations and state the president's case. Instead of picking up a phone, Dave Gergen picked up his pen and scribbled a note to Haig's aide, Joanne. "Is there no way to bring these circulars under control? Many people over here find some of them offensive, others dangerous if they ever reach the press, and a few, like this one, unethical if not illegal. Does anyone really think taxpayers pay for government lines in order to have White House staffers call radio talk shows?" On Wednesday afternoon, May 1st, the Judiciary Committee voted almost exactly along party lines, 20-18, to inform the president that the transcripts did not satisfy the subpoena. Haig told the senior staff that if Republican support held, the committee would have to proceed without the tapes. The president's strategy appeared to be working. It was doubtful that an attempt to cite him for contempt could succeed. As long as the committee remained divided along partisan lines, Haig said, the president was protected. By the close of that business day, the government printing office had sold out its entire first printing of the transcripts. The president sent one copy to David and Julie Eisenhower's home. Julie didn't want to read it, but David stayed up nights reading that week. The president's family was upset by his decision to concede the transcripts. The cold printed words they felt in no way conveyed the president's hurt and concern during those awful months in 1973, the fear for his aides' futures for his administration. The transcripts made Nixon out to be cynical, petty, selfish. The family knew otherwise. They thought, just as he did, that his enemies would use the transcripts to tear him apart. If his enemies couldn't find anything much in the substance, Nixon had said, they would use the shadow. David Eisenhower knew how the president talked in private, and he knew equally well that there was no way the transcripts could hide it, even with all the expletives deleted. The idiom of the White House under Nixon was hard-nosed and brutal. It had been that way in David's grandfather's day. He assured Nixon that language and tone were sham issues. David was more concerned about the president's muddling approach to things and his indecision. The transcripts had surprised him, and he felt both relief and foreboding. They seemed to establish that the president had no advanced knowledge of the Watergate break-in and espionage, but they had also shown David a president who was careless, amoral, and unclear in his own mind. David wondered about his father-in-law. If Watergate had been handled that way, what about other things? Leonard Garment looked at the problem of the tapes in dramatic terms. He could not understand why Nixon hadn't destroyed them before their existence was publicly revealed. If Shakespeare had written this, Garment observed, or Pirandello or Pinter or even Mickey Spillane, it would be essential that Nixon undertake, but fail in, an attempt at their destruction. that he be tripped by a Secret Service agent as he ran to the incinerator, or that he be apprehended as his bathrobe caught in the door. That would at least lend authority to the drama. But for the president first to record the evidence of his own shabby complicity, and then to preserve the tapes, was an act of transcendental lunacy, Garment thought. On Garment's stage, life was a process of being better than the worst side of oneself. Let me read that again. On Garment's stage, life was a process of being better than the worst side of oneself. But Nixon, he said, had a peculiar monster perched on his shoulder that whispered into his ear and onto his tapes. With the release of the transcripts, Nixon had allowed America into the ugliness of his mind, as if he wanted the world to participate in the despoliation of the myth of presidential behavior. The transcripts, Garment thought, were an invasion of the public's privacy, of its right not to know. That was the truly impeachable offense. That was the truly impeachable offense, letting everyone see. Thus we come to the end of chapter 11, and in our next session, we'll begin chapter 12. Thank you for watching.